Hi, Stu Stover, back again. I wanted to do the next step, which is to look at how the Great Depression not only happened, but what the effects were as we looked at American society. So one of the things we look at here is America has got to be one of the richest countries in the world for good reason. We have lots of resources and a very wealthy country in terms of all kinds of ways. So how could this devastation have actually showed up? Those are great questions that we don't always have great answers for. But what I wanted to do is divide this between Herbert Hoover and the Republican administration and the Republican approach to the Great Depression, which actually lasted almost 4 years. Hoover was responsible for the first 4 years, and so today we hear, well, if we hadn't gone down the Roosevelt path of a big government and doing all this stuff, eventually the free market system would have corrected itself, as it did in previous depressions. The answer is they had 4 years. It just kept getting worse. And so we didn't see any of those automatic righting of the ship or corrections happening in the first 4 years. And we're going to talk a little bit about what Hoover tried to do and what the issues were. And then as we look at some of the Roosevelt stuff in terms of his response to this. So let me just give you one quick one off the top. In a recession right now, if we were to have one of the things that we do is we tend to ramp up military spending. Okay, what does that mean? It means we hire more troops. And so what that gives is an opportunity for the 18 to 21, 22-year-olds to go find a job, even if it's in the military. Okay, and that's kind of a safety valve that we have in our system right now, that the military kind of plays, at least to some degree, that role. Well, in those days, the military was minimal, and I mean minimal. And so you had a small, very small professional force. Idea being, this goes back to Revolutionary War, but the Minuteman approach. If we need the troops, we'll bring them in, give them a little bit of training, and send them off to do their stuff, which may have worked up until World War II. But in World War II, we're going up against the Germans with a very professional military, and sort of ill-equipped, ill-trained troops didn't actually work very well. So we had to create a real military. But in the 1930s, you had very minimal military presence. And the Congress didn't want to spend money on new ships or new technology or any of the other stuff. And so it wasn't a safety valve in this era that it certainly has been in previous eras. So let's go back to Herbert Hoover. So very much the free market, laissez-faire approach to economics, which, okay, there's a lot of pluses, obviously some minuses to that as well too, just like there is with any theory. But the notion is that we're going to focus on the supply side of the economy. Okay, so if you're going to focus on the demand side, you're focusing on us. So you're making sure we have the ability to be consumers and spend money, and we typically drive the economy. And you look at GDP today, and we are a huge portion of what GDP is. So supply side meant that we're focusing on the needs of the business community. And so what Herbert Hoover's response was to create a pot of money, big pot of money in those days, that would provide loans to the business community. That's a supply side strategy. And the idea is you give, in essence, free loans, no interest, or minimal interest to the business community. Then they can build new plants, they can hire more workers, they can expand, they can innovate, they can do all the things that the business community is supposed to do. What's a minor problem with that in 1929 to 1933? Business community didn't have anybody buying their existing product, so why would they hire workers? Why would they expand? Why would they do any of this stuff? Because you got to have customers. You got to have a market out there to tap into. Well, another issue that shows up here is something called Smoot-Hawley. And so these two Congress folks said, as the Great Depression is sort of ripping through American society, they said the solution is we're going to dramatically raise tariffs on the rest of the world. And the idea is we want to protect American industry. And we want to protect, and so we don't want Americans buying foreign goods. So we're going to have these high tariffs as a way to protect it. And the assumption was, of these two guys, no other country would retaliate, or what we call today reciprocal trade. So if you impose these rules on me, guess what we're going to do to you? We're going to impose the same rules on you. And so even though we had a ton of international trade leading into the Great Depression, it pretty much dried up. The whole international trade system that had been created pretty much dried up in the Great Depression. And so these two guys thought they were doing America first. Obviously, that was part of the theory of the day. But what they ended up doing was just, adding more pressure that made the Great Depression even worse. So typically, international trade jobs, both import exports, tend to be good jobs. They make reasonable wages, and so these guys ended up, unintended consequences, just horrible stuff ended up happening. So you had the supply side solutions that weren't working. You had a collapse across the board in all sorts of arenas, and no safety nets in those days. So people were kind of on their own, all sorts of consequences. Some of you know this, but we call this decade the birth-dearth generation. So they didn't have many babies. Well, they didn't have birth control, so we could ask how they managed that in those days, but they didn't have babies because they didn't want to bring a baby into this world of the Great Depression. Awful stuff. I could tell you some personal stories of my grandparents and others, but we're not going to do that now. So 1932, November, Roosevelt gets elected to deliver, quote, hope to America. Well, he doesn't take office until April of 1933. And so April 33 was probably the depths of the Great Depression. So we're talking 25% unemployment. 25. That doesn't include the underemployment, meaning people had a job but they weren't actually making enough money to survive. It also didn't count most women, because the assumption was women were in the home, they weren't in the workplace. It didn't include a lot of minorities, because we didn't count them in those days. And so it was actually, in realistic terms, much higher than that. So part of this supply side approach is that if you can't sell your products, okay, so Henry Ford can't sell his Model Ts or whatever he's selling in this particular era, the idea is you drop the price. So you drop the price to low enough that people will actually buy it again. Well, how do you still stay profitable? Okay, what you got to do is you got to lower the wages of the employees. And so you had this notion that as the price of goods drops, then wages drops too. Well, wait a minute. Who's going to buy all these products if their wages are going down across the system? So it was really devastating in terms of what was going on just on unemployment. So before I get to fiscal policy, let me do Social Security. So Social Security showed up in 1935. And so the old system was old people were taken care of either by their families or by charity. And I use that loosely because there were government county poorhouses and there were other mechanisms. Were any of those systems out there desirable to live in? No, probably not. And so what was going on in the midst of the Great Depression, can the family take in their old folks? They can't even feed their kids, let alone their old folks. And so what was happening is, because of the just sheer magnitude of Great Depression, all of these mechanisms to take care of problems in society were just going away. I mean, churches couldn't do it. I mean, the churches could barely survive and pay their minister or whoever in this period. Could they take care of a whole bunch of other people who were wandering around trying to find a better place to live or work or whatever? And the answer is none of those systems were showing up. So Social Security showed up as a way to make sure that our senior citizens were not being forced to die, not being forced to eat dog food or choose between food and heating their house, or any of those really stark choices. But it gave some level of security, kind of a safety net, for our senior citizens, because the systems to take care of that stuff in the past had failed. So the government is doing what we call today fiscal policy. This is John Maynard Keynes, a British economist who was kind of the author of doing a different approach to deal with the Great Depression, because he was concerned, as were many, that in the Great Depression you had people on the left that thought a communist a communist system, Russia or whatever, was the way to go. I mean, it's the only way we could solve our problems. So you had people on the right saying Hitler and a dictatorship, authoritarian, was the only way to go. And here's a bunch of people in the middle going, we'd like to keep our democracy, we'd like to keep our system in place, but we got to have a way to deal with these problems. So what Roosevelt did, and again, this is very, very quick, far too easy to do it this way, but he started having the government spend money. So you had all of these programs, the WPA, the CCC, the alphabet soup of agencies that showed up, and the idea with all these agencies was to put people back to work, to do projects, to do things that were good for America, whether it was roads or parks or pick an issue. And the idea was, is you put money in people's pockets, what are they going to do with it? Surprise, surprise, they're going to go spend it. And you have something that showed up in economics, the circular flow of money as it moved around the system. As one person gets money, they go to the grocery store and they buy stuff. What does the grocery store do? They then buy more food or hire more people or whatever, and it moves around the system. And it's called, in economic terms, velocity of money. And the faster money moves around the system, the better it is for all of us. And so did that happen overnight? Of course not. And so this is 1933 when we kind of start this. Great Depression doesn't actually officially end until the start of World War II. And then what do? We do a huge influx of government money into the economy to millions of troops in uniform and planes and tanks and all the stuff for World War II. And all of a sudden, the economy just shoots back into full production and full employment in some real sense. Wages can go up a bit. And suddenly we get this notion that life can finally get back to some sense of normal again. And so for what it's worth, there's a bunch of issues here. We establish protection for workers, and so the idea is that workers shouldn't be the one to bear the burden of having impossibly low wages. And in a Great Depression, what would a business owner say? I'm going to pay you a whole lot less. You don't like it? Go away. I got 100 people out the gate that would be happy to work for those wages. So one of the reasons we have a minimum wage is that minimum wage isn't for the good times. Minimum wage is for the bad times. And so there were a lot of issues that showed up, just astonishing amount of fundamental change in our system based on the Great Depression and based on what happened in World War II. And at some point we'll talk about what happened in the 1950s, because that's important to look at as well too in terms of American economic history. So hopefully this was helpful in terms of getting a framework for making sense of the Great Depression and why we can never let it happen again. Thank you very much.